Welcome to Outcast, the podcast where we hear coming out stories from famous faces and brilliant LGBTQ plus people working hard behind the scenes, from all backgrounds and from all corners of the globe. On this podcast, we discover life stories, and in doing so, we dissect some of the most pressing issues faced by the LGBTQ plus community today. We hope we can support and inspire you, our listeners, whether you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, out or not, or an ally listening to learn more. I'm Rosie Pentreath, your host, and I've shared my coming out story in writing and on various panels, and I know firsthand the value of talking through my experiences. Now I'm giving people from all corners of life and from all backgrounds the same opportunity. You may have listened to other episodes before, and if you have, thank you for coming back. Or you may be here for the first time because of our guest. Welcome. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening. Today we're welcoming Monica Mulholland to the show. Monica was elected president of the Rotary Club of Queenstown in 2016, only months after she had come out as trans. She was the second trans person in the world to ever serve as a president of a Rotary Club. Raised in Ireland in the 1960s, Monica lived all over the world before living in New Zealand. She was in her 50s when she came out, unable to hide her true self any longer. At one point, Monica describes exploring her identity through dressing up in women's clothes as a hobby for nearly 50 years until she and her wife were ready to set a date to come out. She also said she would have been taken to receive an exorcism from a local priest had she come out as trans to her Irish Catholic parents in the 1960s. She says these things casually in the flow of her story, but when you take them in isolation and think about them, they're so profoundly dark and so profoundly sad. No member of her family has spoken to her since she came out as trans 7 years ago. Listening to Monica's story was a unique insight into what it's like being transgender in a completely different generation and a completely different society from today. The story shows a positivity and a resilience that's inspiring for all trans people, all queer people, and all people all over the world. Hi, Monica, over in New Zealand. Welcome to the podcast. It's so fantastic to have you on to share your story.
Thank you, Rosie. It's a pleasure to be here.
First of all, could you introduce yourself?
My name is Monica P. Mulholland. It's not always been my name, but that's what it is now. I was born in a small town in Ireland called Fermoy, and I grew up in a very Catholic, conservative family and town. When I was born, they looked between my legs and said, "It's a boy." And they were wrong. And so it took me over 50 years to actually come out and, become myself. One of the really important things about my life is that when I was 19, I met my wife. I jokingly call her my former mistress, my ex-mistress when I introduce her. That always gets some good laughs. And when she was 17 and I was 19 when we started going out together. And early on in the relationship, I don't know what actually prompted me to do this other than I felt it would be wrong if she were to continue in the relationship with me. I told her, that I was transgender, or not that we had the words back then because, being good old Catholic Ireland, 50 years ago, the words, the concepts weren't there. So I tried to explain as much as I could to her. And that was, I suppose, that was a bit of a risk for me, but I knew I trusted her. Because, we come from the same town, our parents know each other. My best friend is her first cousin. She knows all my sisters. Her sisters and my sisters were all in the same class in school. And so if it got out, at that stage, my life would have been shit. Really would have been.
There's so much to talk about there just in that introduction, but I want to roll back a little bit. You mentioned coming out properly when you were in your 50s, which I really want to talk about a bit later on. But let's rewind a bit. Do you remember the sort of moment, or perhaps moments, and sort of the time in your life where it was dawning on you, this sort of secret that you told your girlfriend then?
I knew about 5 or 6 that I was wrong, that there was something wrong with me, and I was really probably in the wrong body. I'm the oldest, and there's 6 girls straight after me, so I wonder how that might have affected my life. I remember at school, I don't remember the incidents, but I remember the nuns telling my mother that when people would gang up on me or hit me in the schoolyard, I would not retaliate. I just had no concept of, fighting back and this kind of thing.
Mm.
And later on, when I was about 7 or 8, they sent me, well, maybe 9, I suppose, they sent me to boxing to make a man of me, and that was a disaster. I went, 2 or 3 times to the boxing gym, and in some sparring competition, some guy hit me in the nose, and I ended up crying, and I ran home, and I never went back.
It sounds really difficult. It sounds like your childhood was, impossibly difficult. Were there any kind of moments of joy, any kind of lightness coming through?
During that time, it didn't dwell on me. This was pre-puberty, so I didn't really know what was happening anyway. I do know because my mother told me that she caught me, dressing in her clothes and things like that. She did catch me once. I
Mm.
don't remember when she caught me, but she never caught me again. I was doing it forever. So those were moments of joy. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
If I'd come out then to my parents, well, firstly I would have been taken to the priest to be exorcised probably, and then I would have been put in some kind of a home for bewildered children or something, because back in the 1960s in Ireland, in Catholic Ireland, that just wasn't a feature. We didn't have divorce, we didn't have abortion, we none of those things. So
Mm, mm. You wrote in Mindfood that people sometimes ask when you decided to become a woman, and of course your reply is, "No, I was always a woman."
I was always a woman.
Can you explain for our listeners who are allies or who are other LGBTQ+ listeners who might not be as familiar with the trans experience, what that means?
Oh, there are a number of aspects to that question, actually, because there is the guilt aspect and the burden that you carry of this goddamn secret, which, wears you down. Because, you can't be true, you can't be your real self for so many reasons, societal ones and shame ones, and all that kind of thing. But I suppose it's like having a twin or something like that. You have somebody else who's almost inside of you. You're sharing your life with 2 people, and they're both you. And you've got to be careful and guard one, and make sure that she doesn't get exposed, or that she doesn't nobody finds out about her. But it's really important, I think, is to have somebody you trust and can tell that secret to. And I couldn't do that until I met my ex mistress. She was very supportive of me, even though it was a burden for her as well. She helped me, dress and get clothes for me and buy clothes for me and that kind of thing. So
I really like how you put it that you were like a twin for 2 reasons. The first, it sounds like you were sort of having an out of body experience from the woman you were in a sense, which is interesting to me. And then the closeness to that person. I'm actually a twin myself, an identical twin, so I can see the porousness of the 2 individuals that are kind of the same,
yes,
essentially. Yeah. Let's talk about your wife now, your former mistress. You met at 19. Her name is Joan. Tell me a bit more. I mean, you've already articulated so beautifully the trust you guys had, and she was accepting, but how did she approach, your identity and you being a trans woman?
well, she didn't, and I don't think we ever taught at that stage. It was more of a hobby, I suppose, at that stage, and it would happen at home. And there was definitely no expectation from her that I would ever go outside. And while I would, I suppose, try and put pressure on to go outside. I thought it wasn't realistic. I suppose I could have probably gone to clubs in London, and I did think about that, but she was against it. And I didn't want to do anything which would put pressure on her, carrying the burden that of having your partners, trans anyway is bad enough, but unless she was happy. And when it came to actually transitioning, wasn't prepared to do it unless she was happy. But the pressure was very much on me internally. I think as testosterone ran down, my natural testosterone ran down, the pressure became really, really hard. And then one of our very good friends, who was the same age as me, also from Ireland and also called Joan, she got esophagus cancer and very nearly died. And that must have been about 10 years ago. And that really made me think that time is running out, and I really want to go as who I am rather than who I've been pretending to be. She could see that, and it was getting to the stage where honestly the internal pressure was just too much. I couldn't do it. It was either going to be that or something drastic. And then I then the whole ethos, or I suppose the whole zeitgeist changed, because we had Caitlyn Jenner coming out, and we had Laverne Cox, on the front of Time, and Caitlyn Jenner on the front of Vanity Fair. And just around that time, it was starting to become acceptable in some ways. And so we set the date a couple of times, and either she chicken out or I chicken out or something. And then finally, actually, it'll be 7 years tomorrow.
It's such a huge journey for you both, for you, of course, but also for Joan, and to have someone like that at your side is pretty powerful.
I think people tend to focus on the transgender people and forget that there are wives and mothers out there who who are the support in the background, and they tend to get forgotten about. But it's traditional, or has been traditional, that when you come out, you lose half your friends and half your family. And certainly none of my family have chosen to meet me as Monica. And so in 7 years, I've not seen any of my family. I've probably lost maybe one or two friends, but nothing serious.
I'm so sorry. As the representation that you talk about, the kind of acceptance that you talk about around that 2014 time with Laverne Cox, and with such a broadening of representation, things like this will become less and less common. But sadly, it's still such the case. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people today. What was it like coming out in your 50s and having that gender confirmation surgery and coming out in your 50s compared to what you perhaps see for trans people who are younger?
Well, it really felt like you were, pushing the boundaries. And fortunately, because the zeitgeist had changed, there was no real pushback against me. I just managed accidentally to surf the wave, and it really was an easy wave. So, but I think you still kind of are aware of the fact that you're pushing the boundary, and that you have to push the boundary. And I was determined when I came out that I would push the boundary. And if anybody asked me to do a talk on being transgender, I always did it, and I always, I would never hid the fact that I'm transgender. I think once you get into the role and you play the role and you look the part, I think people just kind of forget. It's a bit like knowing that, oh well, yeah, Joe had his hip replaced 10 years ago, whatever. Yeah, these things, but you kind of forget about them. It doesn't. You're not reminded of them anymore. You accept people as they are, which I wasn't expecting. But yeah, that's the way it has been.
That's a really positive experience that you've described. So you're currently district chair of Inner Wheel, and you were the first trans person in that role. Before that, you were president of Queenstown Rotary Club in New Zealand. Can we start with Rotary Club 101? For any listeners who aren't familiar, what is a Rotary Club?
Traditionally, or how it started was businessmen in the community, and it was men all back then. So it's about 100, it's over 100 years old, and would come together to use their skills to solve what they saw as local problems. That tradition has carried on. So now, we will raise money for things like Shelter Box, which is a disaster relief organization, or we will, raise money for the Women's Refuge, or we will raise money for child cancer, or we will raise money for, the floods in New Zealand, which we've had in the North Islands, and we will use the skills that we have either in fundraising or in management or whatever, finance or in managing people, to do various things within the community to help the community.
Yeah, and what drew you and Joan to Rotary clubs in the first place?
Well, when we came to Queenstown, we didn't know anybody, so we thought the most sensible thing to do, we actually did two things. We joined the Rotary Club, and then we also joined the Table Walkers, which is a walking organization, and which went out every week. And we went out every week with them, and we went to Rotary every week, and quite quickly built up a coterie of friends and acquaintances. They get to know you, you get to know them. And I think one of the original ideas about Rotary is that by doing projects or doing work together, you get to know the people, and you know then who you can rely on, who you can't rely on. Then taking it on who you might do business with, who you might not do business with, because you get a feel for the various people within the community.
So I was aware of them in kind of a vague way before we spoke, and it's fantastic to kind of learn more about how they're community focused and things. But I see them as kind of fairly conservative and old fashioned from the outside. You mentioned them not allowing women for a long time, them being a men's club. What would you say to me, who's got an outdated view of Rotary clubs, about that? Are they conservative or are they getting progressive?
Well, I think, I'm proof of the pudding. Within a year of transitioning, I was the president of the Rotary Club. I was the second ever transgender president of a Rotary Club in the world. And when I was the president, I held a Rotary LGBT community information exchange. So I gathered around the people from the LGBT community in Queenstown and brought them to the Rotary meeting, and we all, talked to each other. The idea being that it's hard to hate somebody when when you hear their story, when you know their story, and so like any kind of mistrust on both sides, because I mean the LGBT people would think what a bunch of boring old farts because they're on a conservative, and it's only by sharing experiences and sharing information and sharing stories that you learn. Well, we're all kind of the same, we're all got our own issues, and we're all trying to just get on with things. And I think that worked very well. And I got letters of commendation from the district governor and from the Rotary International president for doing that. I think it's the first time it's ever been done in Rotary. And now, of course, we have a Rotary LGBT fellowship, of which I'm on the board of as well. So it's kind of boring being LGBT now. Like, we're going to move on to something else because.
Outcast. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today. There are some sort of trans controversies around at the moment. The media is kind of, I would argue, politicising, and governments are sort of politicising the trans experience, some might say, and I think broadly that's very true. The author J.K. Rowling's position and repeated comments sort of doubling down like anti-trans rhetoric. Back up in the Northern Hemisphere in Scotland, we've got the fallout from the government's historic gender recognition bill, which allows people to legally change their gender, which is obviously life-saving for so many people who are assigned the wrong gender at birth. Things like that are happening, but then media coverage is creating a sort of backlash. What does media amplification of these issues and the stories attached to them mean for the global trans community?
It's just part and parcel of the development, the getting used to, and the exploration of the whole thing. And in 5 or 10 years' time, it's kind of one of those growth cycles you've got to go through. And and come out the other end. And, it's like looking back and saying, well, we couldn't possibly have women in the workplace. I mean, all they'd be doing is gossiping all the time and putting on their makeup. I mean, seriously. These are kind of natural cycles which people have to get through, have to get used to. And like you'd never hear anybody say anything like that now. When I was growing up in Ireland, as soon as you got married as a woman, you had to give up your profession.
Mm.
You can't even imagine that now. A woman didn't even have her own credit card. She couldn't.
Yeah.
Or her own bank account. That's bonkers. That's crazy. But like then it just seemed quite
Yeah.
natural.
Yeah, it's reassuring in a sense then that history has these cycles and that these cycles get passed through, and even though they're painful at the time and they are unconscionably painful, that they do go in cycles. What would you say to somebody who's listening, who's trans, out or not, who's feeling vulnerable and needs support?
I'm very conscious of the fact that we have in the transgender community TDOR, Transgender Day of Remembrance. And I'm very conscious of the fact that in some parts of the world, um, violence against trans women is actually an epidemic.
Mm.
Um, a trans woman is murdered somewhere in the world every day. Last year, I think there were 460 transgender women murdered. It depends on the situation you're in. Obviously, it would be not in your best self-interest to come out if you're in one of those environments, because super macho environments tend to be very hard for transgender women. Most of the deaths and murders of transgender women tend to be in South America, where you do get quite macho environments. Your personal safety has always got to come first, and I'm very conscious of my personal. Well, I have been. I mean, I've never had any pushback, and when I go abroad, I'm still, I watch, and even here, um, I Joan's much better than this because she will introduce me as her wife and she'll hold my hand. I feel slightly uncomfortable holding hands in public because it's drawing attention to us, and
Mm.
there are nutters out there, and nutters could take umbrage to. But having said that, recently, about 3 years ago, we went to Texas, and Texas is where the most transgender women in the US are murdered. And I was very apprehensive going there. I must say, a bit apprehensive going there, but we had nothing. I mean, there was nothing whatsoever. It was perfectly fine. It's only if you're in a bar late at night, something like that, and if you're already had a bottle of wine and there's some idiot in there who wants to take you on, or I don't know, but I mean, it's never happened to me here, so or even remotely.
Like you say, and like you alluded to earlier, it's not all doom and gloom. In around 2014, there was this watershed moment of more TV shows than ever with, crucially, not just trans representation, positive, inspiring women, shows like Orange is the New Black, Transparent, more and more shows like Euphoria, L Word, Generation Q. Why is positive media representation like this so important?
One of my sayings in a reel is, the best gift you can give the world is empowered women, because empowered women will change the world, and they will. And I think that's same for transgender. I mean, just look at what has happened in Iran and probably will happen. They will change. The women of Iran will change Iran because they're not prepared to be put down. And I think it's having positive images of transgender people or LGBT people, you know, helps empower them, and helps empower them, gives you confidence. And if you have confidence, people will be reluctant to take you on, or to mess with you. So I think it's one of these positive spirals. It's a self-reinforcing positive spiral. The more confident you are, the more empowered you are. The more empowered you are, the more confident you are, etc.
Yeah.
To some extent, we're all still pretty tribal. We're a tribal people, and anybody outside your tribe is always suspicious. You're always suspicious of them, or you're always wary of them because they're not like us. And breaking down that not like us barrier has really got to be good for everybody.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. I want to end on a hopeful note. What gives you personally hope for now or for the future?
I think because of the the internet and the explosion of information that has given. I mean, when I was in my 20s and 30s, there was no internet. And I've got a friend in Australia who's gay. She came from north of Sydney. And when she was growing up, she knew she had these weird, in normal terms, she had these weird, desires for women, but she couldn't understand, and there was no way she could find it. The local library didn't have anything on lesbians. The fact that there's information out there that you can actually find out about yourself and that there are other people like you. I think that is really helps people an awful lot. It's the lack of information and the lack of being able to understand yourself or people slightly different or dissimilar from you, which is no information on. So I think it's the flow of information and the access to information helps people.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's a very lucky time that I feel we're in. And I know further and further as time progresses, people will feel even more lucky as they think about this kind of thing.
My friend who had the other Joan, who almost died of cancer, she says, if you're going to be born a woman, the last 50 years is the best time ever to be born a woman. And it's so true, And if you're going to be born LGBT, probably, the last 20 years is probably the best time to be born LGBT, because otherwise you've been burned at the stake, or, God knows what would have happened to you.
Yeah, so true. So true. Well, thanks so much for sharing your story and for sharing your thoughts on the trans experience, the LGBTQ plus experience, and yeah, your generosity with telling us so honestly about what you've been through and about what Joan has been through as well.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Outcast, a podcast with interviews and coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening.